the Super Nintendo officially launched in North America, officially marking the transition from third to fourth console generations, officially entering a shifting scene less hospitable to the Nintendo name, officially preparing itself for a war unlike any other in the industry thus far, and officially becoming venerated as one of the most super systems ever sanctioned. Nintendo was on top of the world in 1990. Sales were soaring, companies like Acclaim and Konami were raking in profits so profusely that they were granted exceptional licensing agreements that allowed them to produce in excess of their 5-game-a-year limit, and the cultural colossus was one of the most popular household names. You'd be hard-pressed to find a parent who wasn't familiar with the label. Nintendo was huge, owning 90% of the video game market share. They were the industry, but competition had been kindled. The introduction of the TurboGrafx and Sega's Genesis in 1989 would kick the next generation into gear, and though both systems were initially slow to enjoy any serious measure of popularity, by 1991 the technical capabilities of 16-bit hardware had rendered the 8-bit glory days of the NES near obsolete. Designed by one Masayuki Uemura, by the time the Super Nintendo hit North American homes, it was at a gross disadvantage. With the Sega Genesis's edgy marketing campaign, its established library of well over 100 games, including a virtual monopoly on sport games that mirrored the Intellivisions a decade earlier, and its cheaper price point, the Genesis was an oil field for Sega. All it took was a hedgehog to strike a match on June 23rd. But the SNES had its selling points too. While it may have lost several exclusive licensing arrangements with top third-party developers, it still retained the loyalties of major players, including Capcom and Square. And though its initial catalog only comprised some 12 titles, its library would come to include some of the most revered games ever made. Most sequels to established franchises, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Super Castlevania, but RPGs did become one of the most critical cruxes of the console, more than ever appealing to a Western audience in the widely regarded masterworks that were Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and Super Mario RPG. Who would have thought that game would have kicked Koopa ass? Software sells hardware, not the other way around, and Nintendo still had the software to back up their seal of quality. Visually, the SNES blew its trumpet as loudly as the Genesis, though in differing details. Whereas the Genesis was all about speed, the SNES was supposed to be all about color and overall hardware power. Mode 7 was the counterpoint to blast processing, one of the main bullet points for the machine. A graphical graft that enabled various games to immerse the gamer with a pseudo 3D world, which was mostly utilized for racing games like F-Zero and Super Mario Kart, and for RPG overworlds like in Link to the Past. But it undeniably looked unbelievably awesome, and paired with the enhancement chip software upgrades that made polygonal depth possible, gave the 2D gamer a taste of the coming 3D age, hinting on the horizon. Even with its policy of dumbing down the violence in controversial ports like Mortal Kombat or Wolfenstein 3D, a move that would cost them serious sales points next to Sega, who, with their target of an older audience, would preserve all that blood and guts. The Super Nintendo lived on well into the 32-bit generation. Much of that owing to the smash success of Donkey Kong Country, the graphical gem that proved to the world that the console still had legs. Decades later, the Super Nintendo has retained its reputation retrospectively, and continues to be lauded and loved from lord to laborer. Happy birthday, Super Nintendo, and whoa, happy birthday PlayStation and Dreamcast. That's right, the Super Nintendo wasn't the only console to be released this day in gaming.